video, we turn our attention to ServiceNow's configuration application in the Configuration Management Database, or CMDB. And I'll be honest with you from the start, this can be a broad and complex topic, but it doesn't have to be. As always, we'll work through the ins and outs of ServiceNow and the CMDB with the focus on learning what's important and keeping things as simple as possible. Some of the keywords to look for in this video include configuration management, CMDB, configuration item, discovery, service mapping, identification and reconciliation engine, and class. I'm Jeff from ServiceNow Simple. I appreciate you being part of the course. Let's jump into it. You and me and the ServiceNow CMDB. Okay, let's start by taking a peek at our topic from an application and platform perspective. And to do that, I'm going to open the All menu and navigate down to the application named Configuration. This is the application we're talking about here. Initially, when I saw this application, I thought this was for setting up the configuration of the ServiceNow instance, like a place to tweak properties and settings for how the platform operates. Well, that was totally wrong. Once I poked around a bit, I realized that this configuration application is really built for enabling a company's configuration management function and the CMDB. We'll learn what those things are in just a second, but for now, I want you to notice the size of this application, the number of categories and modules that exist here. It's huge. If it's not the largest application, it's one of the largest in the entire platform. And check this out. I'll open the table, that's sys_db_object, and I'm going to add a filter to only include tables that include CMDB in the name. These are the tables that support that configuration application. Nearly 1,000 of the 5,000 total tables in ServiceNow's database, or 1/5, are built to support the configuration management function. Again, it's huge, and here's why. Configuration management and the CMDB are foundational components of the ServiceNow platform. They're like the cornerstone upon which most of the platform's applications and workflows and capabilities depend. You might say ServiceNow is CMDB-centric. So let's settle on a couple of important definitions up front. We'll start with configuration management. Configuration management is a process that enables a company to understand from an operational perspective how their IT components, mostly hardware and software, are configured and connected to provide value in the form of IT services. And this application in the application navigator named configuration is filled with modules that provide tools and workflows and dashboards that support that configuration management process. One of the tools used to support that process, in fact the primary tool, is the Configuration Management Database, or CMDB. The CMDB is a set of database tables that store a logical model of a company's IT components, again, mostly hardware and software, and the services they provide, and the relationships that exist between them. So those nearly 1,000 tables we just looked at are all part of the ServiceNow CMDB. Why so many tables? Because there's a table for just about every type of IT component you can imagine, including hardware and software and services. So the idea is for a company to identify all of their IT stuff down to a very detailed level and create a record in the database to represent each item. These items would include things like computers and network cards, routers, printers, cables, racks, cooling devices, software applications, databases, servers, virtual servers, services, and on and on. Each record in the CMDB represents one of those IT components and gets stored in a table that's designed specifically to store the attributes of whatever that item is. That's what those 1,000 tables are for. Each of the records in the CMDB is called a configuration item, or CI. So, for a more official definition, let's say that a configuration item, or CI, is a record in the CMDB that represents an IT component that needs to be managed in order to deliver services. And CIs can be tangible, like hardware and software, or they can be intangible, like services. One last thing I'll mention here is the fact that while having all of these items in a database is great, what really makes this valuable is understanding how they're configured and connected together to provide something useful. For that reason, the CMDB also stores the relationships that exist between those different CIs. If you put this all together, it becomes possible to create a picture of how IT infrastructure is configured and connected to provide services. That makes it possible to quickly diagnose problems, predict potential issues, and understand the impact of making changes in the future. And that's really important stuff for effective IT operations and service management. So we have this set of 1,000 tables that make up the CMDB, and naturally, we can't discuss them all here, but I do want to bring your attention to 4 tables that are particularly important. The first 2 are what I describe as the base tables of the CMDB. Those are the base configuration item table, CMDB, and the configuration item table, CMDB_CI. If you remember back in our database intro lessons, we learned that the ServiceNow database includes the ability for a table to be created as an extension of another table, creating a sort of parent-child relationship, and that the child table inherits the properties of its parent and all of its ancestors. Well, the CMDB relies heavily on this table extension capability, and the base configuration item and configuration item tables are at the top of the family tree for all of the CI tables. It starts with the base configuration item table, which defines 47 fields. That table is then extended by the configuration item table, where an additional 33 fields are added. And from there, the family of CMDB tables grows to include all of the different CI types. The further you extend down the hierarchy, the more specific the CIs get. So software and hardware get added, for example. And hardware gets extended by network gear and printer and computer and other stuff. Computer gets extended by mainframe hardware, or personal computer, or server, and other types of computers. And server gets extended by Linux server, Unix server, and Windows server. And on it goes. And I'll show you a great tool called the CI Class Manager in a second that displays this hierarchy in full. But before I do that, I want to tell you about 2 more really important CMDB tables. The CI Relationship Table, CMDB_rel_CI, and the CI Relationship Type Table, CMDB_rel_type. These 2 tables are used to store or model the relationships that exist between the CIs. It's done by inserting a row in the CI relationship table and populating reference fields for a parent CI, a child CI, and a relationship type. These relationship records make it possible to construct a dependency map like this. It depicts all of the infrastructure items that work together to deliver some valuable IT service. So, 4 important CMDB tables you should probably remember and research further if you like. Base configuration item and configuration item, those are the grandparents of all the CMDB CI tables. And CI relationship and CI relationship type that handle the relationships between the CIs. So we have all of these tables set up and ready to store all of the configuration items and the relationships between them, which is great. But how do we get them all populated? To do that, we have a few options. First, we can add items manually using list views and form views. We learned in a previous lesson that every table in the database has at least one list view and form view that we can use to view and make changes and add records. That's true for the CMDB tables also. So we can populate CIs by opening a form and manually entering the information. And that's useful, and in some cases, we'll need to do that. But that's a highly manual and time-consuming and potentially error-prone method. I can tell you, I'm currently working with a client that has many millions of CIs in their CMDB. So manual entry isn't really a solution for populating the CMDB in full. Another option is to build imports and integrations to load the data. It's possible, for example, that a company already has legacy applications to track inventory of things like servers and network gear and printers and other IT assets. We learned in our previous lesson how to build integrations using data sources and transforms and field maps that pull data from an external source and load it into the CMDB. And those imports can then be scheduled to run on a recurring basis to retrieve changes from those legacy sources and update the CMDB to keep the data in sync. That's another option that's widely used by companies to populate the CMDB prior to moving those legacy applications to ServiceNow in full. And finally, the CMDB can be populated through automated discovery tools. In most cases, this is the most efficient, accurate, and preferred method of configuration item ingestion. These are tools that automatically crawl along a network seeking out device connections. Using a set of configurable patterns, devices and software and relationships can be identified and loaded into the CMDB. ServiceNow offers entire training courses that teach the details around automated discovery, but at a fundamental level, it's important to know this. ServiceNow offers two of their own automated discovery tools named Discovery and Service Mapping. The Discovery tool identifies devices and the software running on them. And they call that horizontal discovery. The Service Mapping tool performs vertical discovery, which identifies relationships between the configuration items and maps how they work together to provide services. And it's also possible to use third-party discovery tools like Microsoft SCCM, for example. In fact, you can have multiple discovery tools running to populate a single CMDB. An automated discovery can also be performed on cloud-based networks, which makes it possible to populate the CMDB with CIs running on Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure, for example. So the answer to the question of how to populate the CMDB or where the data comes from is often many places. Each source of data entering the CMDB is called a discovery source. And in most cases, a single CMDB will have multiple discovery sources configured. And that's great, but it comes with a cost in that anytime you have multiple sources of data loading the same database, you run into the risk of conflict and potential inaccuracy. It's possible, for example, to have a configuration item, say a computer, that gets entered manually, loaded via an integration, and discovered automatically. And that's no good unless the system is smart enough to identify that those three items are really the same thing. When multiple CIs get created within the CMDB that really should represent a single real-world item, you end up with duplicate records. It's also possible that a single CI gets updated mistakenly with the attributes that should be represented by some separate item. In a case like this, you end up with a single CI that really should be two different CIs. And this is called overloading. And finally, if multiple discovery sources load data for the same CI, but with different attribute values, the values get updated repeatedly, flip-flopping, and left by whichever source runs last. To solve these problems, all data entering the CMDB must first pass through what ServiceNow calls the Identification and Reconciliation Engine, or IRE. The IRE uses a set of configurable identification and data precedence rules, we'll look at some of those in a bit, to uniquely identify and accurately match items and manage updates to avoid duplication and overloading and flip-flopping. The Identification and Reconciliation Engine can be a bit scary at first. It does a lot, and it can be fairly complex. At this point, though, you don't really need to be an IRE expert. Just be aware that it exists, and that it's constantly working to ensure that as data enters the CMDB, it's added and updated as accurately as possible. Now let's jump into the UI and take a look at some of the most commonly used modules or tools that exist within that configuration application. And we'll start with the CI Class Manager. This is probably my favorite configuration module because it tells us so much about how the CMDB works. It's like the master front end of the CMDB and IRE. I'll navigate to Configuration, CI Class Manager to open it. And that opens this welcome screen that tells us a bit about what this tool provides, including the ability to create new classes, update IRE rules, manage how relationships are configured, and set up health settings. One thing I want to explain real quickly is what's meant by this word class. I'm going to keep it super simple. In the dorky world of software development, a class is a software representation of some object or thing. It's like this obscure thing in the memory of a computer that represents some real-world object, like a piece of hardware or a computer or a network firewall. For each class, there's a corresponding database table in the CMDB. So for our purposes for now, when you see the word class, just think database table. I'll click this Open Hierarchy button to open the CI Class Manager and show you what I mean. That presents this left sidebar, which holds the keys to the CMDB kingdom. What we have here is the entire class hierarchy of everything that the CMDB is set up to manage. And since class equals database table, this is essentially that family tree of those 1,000 database tables that we saw earlier. Notice at the top, and I'll collapse this, that everything extends from the configuration item table. That's that base table we just talked about. In the parentheses, we can see a count of the items that currently exist within that table and any tables that extend it. So since every table extends configuration item, this number is the number of CIs that exist within the entire CMDB. Now if I expand it, I can see all of the tables that extend the configuration item table. That's the first generation of the child tables. I'll scroll down a bit, let you see that there are a lot of tables here that represent all sorts of IT stuff. I'm going to slide down here to the hardware class, and here we can see the number of CIs that exist within the hardware table and all of the tables that extend it. I'll expand hardware and see what tables extend it. Again, lots more specific types of hardware. Here's computer. I'll expand it. Lots of more specific types of computers, like server. I'll expand it. Lots of more specific types of servers. So you get the idea. The CMDB is a set of database tables that store a logical model of a company's IT infrastructure. And ServiceNow's CMDB is built using a set of hierarchical tables, all of which extend the base table named configuration item. And as you move down the hierarchy of tables, things get more specific, and attributes are added as needed. So let's dig a little deeper. I'll scroll back to the top, and I'm going to select the configuration item class. This opens a bunch of details about that class. And on this basic info tab here, we can see the name of the database table, CMDB_CI. I'll click this Attributes tab here, and I can see the fields that are available at this level of the hierarchy. There are 88. I can see the field names and the data types and the reference details and other attributes about the fields. Now, let's jump back to the hierarchy, and I'm going to open the hardware class, which is a direct descendant of the configuration item. Here's the name of the table, CMDB CI hardware. And if I click the Attributes tab, notice that now there are 102 fields. And check this out. I love this. These all derived and added buttons filter the fields based upon where in the hierarchy of tables they were defined. If I click Derived, I can see those 88 fields that the hardware table inherited from the configuration item table, its parent. And if I click Added, I can see the 14 fields have been added directly in the hardware table to store attributes that describe hardware. How cool is that? And this works all the way down the hierarchy as you dig deeper and get more specific. I'm not going to go into detail on everything that the CI Class Manager has to offer in this video, but I do want to touch on just a couple more things so you're aware. First is identification rules, which can be configured here. This would be where we'd begin tweaking how that identification and reconciliation, or IRE, works. An identification rule is a rule that tells the IRE which attributes or fields to use to uniquely identify an item in that CMDB table. Each class can have multiple ID rules that get executed based upon some defined order. So when a discovery source presents an item for entry into the CMDB, the identification rules that are set here are executed by the IRE to check and see if a CI already exists for that item. And if a match is found, that existing CI gets updated with any changes. And if a match is not found, a new CI record gets created in the corresponding table. Reconciliation rules, which get configured here, are the rules that tell the IRE how to proceed when making updates to an existing CI. These are all about managing that flip-flopping that I mentioned earlier. When we have two or more discovery sources telling us different things about a CI, which one should we trust the most? That's the question that reconciliation rules answer. The rules can be applied at the record level or even at the individual field level. Suggested relationships are used to provide guidance on the most common connections that occur between an item and other types of items in the CMDB. And these help define the records that are created in that CI relationship table and the corresponding CI relationship types. The health section here doesn't really impact how the IRE functions, but it provides an opportunity to define parameters around metrics related to completeness, compliance, and correctness. Sort of like setting benchmarks in an attempt to proactively monitor the health of the CMDB as new items are created and existing items are updated. The results of these benchmarks can be seen on the CMDB Health dashboard. And finally, this last tab here labeled CI List opens the list view of the table, providing access to the current list of CIs. And that's the CI Class Manager tool, which tells us a lot about how the ServiceNow CMDB is implemented. But remember, that's just one of over 50 modules included in the UI related to configuration management in the CMDB. The CMDB Data Manager module, for example, allows you to create, publish, and manage CI policies to help maintain the CMDB as it grows. And here's the CMDB dashboard. It provides a holistic view of the quality and the health of CMDB data. And the CMDB Query Builder is a sort of low-code, no-code tool that provides a simple way to query the CMDB for CIs and relationships using a drag-and-drop interface. Lots of modules and database tables and functionality and dependencies on the configuration management database in ServiceNow. And just so you know, the ServiceNow Learning Platform offers entire courses and specializations on the topic of CMDB, but now you know the basics and enough to head into the CSA certification exam confidently, if that's the direction you're headed. And just so you know, I've also published a couple of supplemental videos on the topic of CMDB on our YouTube channel, ServiceNow Simple. So check those out if you'd like. I'll include a link to those in the description and the content of this lesson. In the meantime, you're doing great. Keep up the good work. Thanks for watching this one, and I'll see you in the next lesson.